We're the two teachers.
Where school is always in session.
Andy, we've been looking at the foundations of American government, and nothing more important than understanding that our government has limits. And no better example of those limits that the founding fathers created something we call federalism.
Well, really, it is. I mean, you see this in the 10th Amendment, the last of the Bill of Rights, with the reserve powers that guarantees that there will be state and local government. You cannot underemphasize how important that is. It's a guarantee in our national document that there will be state governments, and that those state governments are reserve powers. They're given powers, which again is part of limiting the powers of central government in dividing up those powers in the different layers in what we call federalism.
Federalism is looking at that relationship between a sovereign central government, the national government, and sovereign state and local governments. It's really a unique experiment, a novel virus in government experimentation. And it works, but it's messy, as we're seeing even now that you've got state governments making decisions that in some cases are different than other states, of course, but then also different from national directives.
And in particularly when you have something like a virus that, of course, doesn't recognize or respect state boundaries or any boundaries for that matter, it's particularly troubling. It looks so chaotic, particularly for those who might be more familiar with countries that are operated by unitary government, where the central government makes all the effective policymaking. But one of the benefits of federalism is that when this is all over, and it will be all over, you're going to go back and be able to see what were those state and local responses and compare them to the central government to see, all right, what didn't work and what worked really well in particular areas where the virus has hit the most.
I love that laboratory of democracy idea, Andy, and no better place to look at that debate over the relationship than looking at those two seminal documents, Federalist 10 and Brutus 1. In Federalist 10, of course, the Federalist Papers were written to advocate a ratification of the new Constitution. And Madison and the boys in Federalist 10 argued we need a large republic, strong central government to avoid the mischief of factions. They were worried about those groups that might try to hijack a government. And so they argued for a little stronger central government than others did. Brutus 1 a little bit different.
Well, yes, they argued for a stronger central government, but knowing that you would have to work and create alliances with those different factions to make it work. Brutus 1 were also known as the anti-federalists. They were very skeptical of the powers of central government. They definitely wanted to restrict the powers of central government. They were very suspicious of parts of the Constitution, like the Supremacy Clause, that seemed to give the central government unlimited powers. And so the anti-federalists, in looking at the responses, the policy responses to COVID-19, they would be particularly pleased to see the roles of state and local governments playing in critical policymaking.
But Andy, don't you think that the Federalists didn't have this in mind when they put little poison pills into the Constitution that made for a stronger central government, despite their innocence that, well, federalism is going to be fine? Think of the Commerce Clause or the Necessary and Proper Clause or the Supremacy Clause. Andy, did I say the 14th Amendment gives tremendous power to the central government? Andy, there are a number of clauses in our Constitution that seemingly point to a much stronger central government than even the founding fathers pretended to acknowledge.
And particularly in Article 1, Section 8, you see those powers specifically listed as enumerated powers, those powers given to Congress, given to the central government. We know there's plenty of concurrent powers where those powers are shared. For instance, the power to regulate education between public schools and the state, and some federal laws that deal with public schools. But you're right, that the chief enumerated power that gave power to the central government was the Commerce Clause. And we see some really critical Supreme Court cases about the Commerce Clause, cases like McCulloch versus Maryland, which certainly gave supremacy to the national government when there was a conflict with state governments, but also allowed this flexible interpretation of the Commerce Clause to apply to the creation of the national bank.
Well, Andy, Brutus would have appreciated the U.S. v. Lopez decision in 95 because, out of nowhere, the Supreme Court said, I think the big national government has gotten a little bit too big. In U.S. v. Lopez, the Supreme Court acknowledged that maybe even a well-intended law like gun sales around schools, but wait a minute, using the Commerce Clause to prohibit certain commerce around schools is a power the national government just doesn't have. Or in this case, went a little bit too far. Brutus would have loved the idea that the Supreme Court, even in our lifetime, can acknowledge a central government with limits.
And keep in mind that we still see this today because to actually change the Constitution formally with what we call constitutional amendments, which we have done less than 30 times. One of the reasons that we haven't amended the Constitution formally more often is because of federalism, that in order to amend the Constitution, you need Congress to propose that amendment with 2/3 of each chamber, which is difficult. But then you also need 3/4 of the states to ratify the Constitution. So they built into the DNA of the Constitution this federalism, that in order to make these changes, state governments would have to acquiesce to those changes. It's really hard to do.
But Andy, even if it's not in the DNA, our federal government has certain tools to make itself bigger through grants and mandates. The courts have recognized that there are times where the U.S. government can mandate certain provisions, certain policies. You must do this. Or by providing by grants, either categorical grants or block grants, the United States government induces states to accept the money in order then they comply with certain national policies. Andy, sounds to me like the national government wins on both sides. They have limits, but yet they also have the tools to appear almost unlimited. Andy, federalism, so important. Keep an eye on that for all us Brutus types. We're the two teachers. No fancy words.
No fancy suits.
Plain talk about issues you need to know.
Just in time.